The main problem is that the people around us, that could be our colleagues, our friends, our family, they hold in their heads and in their hearts perspectives, ideas, insights, wisdom, information, feedback for us, that if we could actually find out what they were really thinking and feeling, we would be better off together. We would be closer in our relationships. We would save time together. We wouldn't make as many mistakes. I mean, we would make better decisions, innovate, all of these kinds of things. The problem is we are stuck because there's this great kind of like treasure trove of insight all around us, and we have no way of getting to it. It wouldn't be a problem if we could read their minds. But it turns out we are really bad at reading their minds. The only way that research has proven reliably lets us know what's on people's minds is simply to ask them. But it's not so simple.
Jeff, thanks for being here on the show today.
Great to be with you, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So we are having a blast pre-show, which is what usually happens, just getting to know each other. And we started out by talking about life and how we talk about life on this show. But the interesting thing is, as I was getting into the ask methodology, I was looking at how you build relationships, not transactions, and how curiosity is so powerful. Talk to our listeners about, let's start there. And that way they can get an understanding of really why you pulled this stuff together and how it's impacting people's lives.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say I didn't know this until I started doing research for the book, but the root of the word curious comes from the Latin care. And so when you are curious about someone, you're caring about them. And I think so many people in the world wish that more people would be curious about them, wish that more people would ask them questions, wish that more people would care about them. And so when we are trying to learn from other people and be curious about them and ask them questions, it's an act of caring. This is not a methodology that's just about extracting information from other people, although there's a lot that we can learn when we do find out what's on their minds. But this is really a methodology that brings us closer to other people, that actually deepens relationships. So love to get into it.
Yeah, it's so true. We talk a lot about the difference between building relationships and transactions on this show. And it's one of the things that I really, really adamantly get frustrated about, because in about 30 seconds, I can tell when someone's coming to me with strictly transaction-driven agendas, or if they genuinely care about what we're trying to accomplish together, what I'm bringing to the table, who I am. And these are things that, to me, the older I get, the less I want to dedicate any time into people that live their life in the transaction world. What have you found in teaching this and in your methodology that could help people build the deeper relationships and kind of go away from what they're taught, especially in business and life? They're taught transactions, and it's the opposite of what we should be teaching.
Absolutely. If you are just interacting with someone to get something from them, or to get a piece of information, people might be happy to share the first time, but if that continues to happen over and over again, people are basically like, this person doesn't care about me. They just care what they can get from me. And so this has got to be a mutual process. When we and I can share more about the specific methodology, but when we start to ask people questions, when we start to listen, it's got to be about us together. One of the things I talk about in the chapter on listening is this idea of no BS listening. And I define BS listening, and this comes from someone, Debbie Irving, who's an amazing thinker. BS listening stands for back to self listening. So when someone is listening to you, you tell them something, and then they say, "Well, that reminds me of this thing about me," or whatever. That is back to self listening. And I talk about BS listening just really is off putting to the other person. And so we need to be thinking about, how do we stay with the other person when they're sharing something with us? How can we actually stay with them? Ask them 3 or 4 follow-up questions before we even consider bringing it back to ourselves.
Yeah, I know, just personally, I am a talkative human. I've always been curious, but I'm very talkative. And time and space in between sentences earlier in my life was a dangerous place, meaning that when it got quiet, I got uncomfortable. And the more uncomfortable I got, the more I would talk. And these are things that you really have to be aware and self-aware of, because you also can find yourself going into a conversation where you're talking about something, or you're waiting to speak instead of listening and active listening. And we would have a very unsuccessful podcast if I kept on that path of being a young man. But really what it comes down to is wanting to be heard. Like
Yes.
what all of us want is to communicate and to connect and to feel heard and understood, right? I mean, seek first to understand, then to be understood. But it's something that I feel like that's what I was leaning into. And once I started to have that bigger self-confidence and that awareness, I was able to transition away. And it doesn't mean you're always there, but it does mean that you're more aware. And I love that aspect of what you're teaching.
Absolutely. Sometimes the most important things will only come out if you let the silence do its work. In the book, I talk about psychotherapists. I interviewed a lot of professional listeners for the book, and one category of professional listeners that I interviewed was psychotherapists, and they talk about this thing called the doorknob moment, which is like, if a therapy session is 50 minutes, at like minute 49 and a half, the patient's on their way out the door, they're touching the doorknob, and that is finally when they say the real thing. I'm thinking about leaving my spouse, or any number of other big things. And it's kind of like, why did they not say that during the first 49 minutes of the session? But there's all kinds of reasons why people don't say the real thing right away. And one of the biggest blockers of people telling you what they really think is you talking in that open space, as opposed to like just letting that space do its work, or even just saying to them, "That's interesting. Tell me more. Say more about that." Because usually the first thing that someone says in an answer to your question is not going to be the most important thing they have to say. So you got to, what I call, pull the thread to really get to that. And hopefully you get to it sooner than the moment they're walking out the door.
Yeah, and this is where curiosity comes in, right? I mean,
Totally.
you have to be curious. I like to be curious about all levels of the communication. So it's not just curiosity in what they're saying, it's how they're saying it. What is their face saying? What is their body language? These are the things that I look for in a conversation to help relieve pressure, to allow for safety.
Yeah,
These are all things, and I want you to talk about that, but I also think it's a good time to go into your methodology because there's a formula that people can execute upon. And I think it leads us into a deeper conversation.
totally. And maybe I'll say a word about what is the problem that the methodology is trying to solve first, just so that we can kind of see like what's the why behind but why bother even doing this. And the main problem that it's trying to solve is that the people around us, that could be our colleagues, our friends, our family, our clients, our investors, whoever, our spouses, they hold in their heads and in their hearts perspectives, ideas, insights, wisdom, information, feedback for us, that if we could actually find out what they were really thinking and feeling, we would be better off together. We would be closer in our relationships. We would save time together. We wouldn't make as many mistakes. I mean, we would make better decisions, innovate, all of these kinds of things. The problem is that too often they don't actually tell us the most important things that they're thinking and feeling. They're keeping them private in their heads for all kinds of reasons. And so, in the book, I talk about what are the biggest things people around you probably aren't telling you, and why are they not telling you those things. It wouldn't be a problem if we could read their minds. But it turns out we are really bad at reading their minds, and even trained like TSA experts are no better than chance at at really knowing what's and some of the most conventional wisdom that we get about how to read other people's minds. Things like try to put yourself in their shoes. It turns out that actually doesn't work because we're not in their shoes. Try to read their body language. It actually doesn't work because we don't, what they're showing on their face may not be exactly what they're thinking and feeling. And so we are stuck because there's this great kind of like treasure trove of insight all around us, and we have no way of getting to it. The only way that research has proven reliably lets us know what's on people's minds is simply to ask them. But it's not so simple. It's deceptively simple to actually ask the right questions the right ways. And so that's the problem that the ask approach is trying to solve. I also see it as an opportunity because if we could actually do this right, we would be closer. We would make better decisions together. We'd be better off together. So now to answer your question, kind of like what is the ask approach? It's 5 practices. They are all grounded in research, but they've been tested over time in lots of different contexts. And when we put them together, it gives us the greatest chance of really unlocking this treasure trove of insight, wisdom around us, and bringing us closer to other people. And to your point, it starts with curiosity. Now, step number 1 is choose curiosity. And I'm talking about a very particular kind of curiosity. I'm not talking about like, I'm curious about the history of Russia or why do trees grow the way that they do. I mean, that's interesting too. I'm talking about a very specific kind of curiosity called connective curiosity. That's the kind of curiosity that connects us to other people because it's curiosity about you. your experiences, your stories, your insights, your feelings, what you see, all of that kind of stuff. And when we have that kind of curiosity about someone else, that the sincerity of our curiosity kind of radiates out, and it people can tell when you're authentically curious, and it cultivates in them a desire to share with you as well. And I call this step choose curiosity, because I believe that we can choose it. I don't think it's just a trait that some people have and other people don't have. I don't think it's just a state of mind, like I'm feeling curious today. Like I really believe it's a decision that's always available to us, um, if we choose it. And when we choose it, what it really means to do is to center in our minds one single question, which is just, what can I learn from you? What can I learn from you? And when that's the question that we have at the center of our minds in any interaction, it starts to push away other things like my judgments about you, or questions like, how do I get you to do what I want you to do? Or why am I so stupid? Or any other kinds of things that block our connection with other people. If I just center, what can I learn from you? It opens up that curiosity. And I think that is something that is so rare for other people to actually feel from someone else, that they just truly want to learn from you. And I believe there really is something that we can learn from every single person, no matter whether they seem like we have, why would I ever learn something from that person? Or even if I seem like my enemy or my opponent, or there's still something I can learn from every single person. So that's the essence of choosing curiosity.
So just a quick point on that. Something that I've noticed recently is, I have lots of friends, lots of connections, and the more curious you become, the more you're aware when others aren't curious.
Absolutely.
And it starts to shape friendships and where I invest my time. And
Me
I was
too.
hanging out with a buddy of mine just this past weekend, and he asked me questions. And sometimes the questions that he asks me with his curiosity actually makes me think about something I had never
Totally.
thought about before. And
It's
and it's so powerful to me that he's unlocking things in me through that question that I don't even realize how few people are asking those questions of me until those questions start, and they're so simple. And
Can
you
you
know
think of any examples of those
yeah,
questions that,
yeah.
yeah.
The other day, something so simple is my buddy asked me a question about real estate that I owned,
Okay.
and it was like, Scott, what are the where are the houses that you own today, and what are their purposes? And it like blew up in my brain because I was like, you know what? I had to think and organize, and I was actually very disorganized, and I was very uncomfortable with how I'm organized in that space, and it has got me into a completely different zone. All through the week I've been organizing and asking questions of my team, and pulling together things. And yes, we no matter how well you have things together, folks, sometimes it's not as together as you want it to be. And that simple question had me go, oh, what about that? I forgot about this. And I was embarrassed when I was answering the question. And I said that. I said, I'm honestly embarrassed that I can't answer this with more clarity. But it gave me a direct insight into something that's probably bothering me internally that I need to clean up and help myself have more structure and organization in and around, because it's gotten to a point where I'm curious and understanding why that made me uncomfortable. And it's I don't know if that's the direction you were looking for, but it
Yeah,
like
totally.
blew up.
I appreciate that story. I mean, I think it's a good illustration that when we exhibit curiosity to other people, it's a gift. It helps them spark their own thinking. I think coaches know this a lot, because coaches use questions all the time, with their clients. But I'll tell you my own life. Like, I'm very sensitive to, when I'm meeting people, the degree to which they express curiosity or not. And my wife and I will often debrief if we go to a party or have get together with people, like, how curious do they seem or not. And for me, I like the more curious someone is, the more I like them. It just, and there's actually really interesting research that people did about dating, where they had people do this kind of like speed dating, and they had some people ask more questions, other people not ask questions, and the people who asked more questions were rated as physically more attractive than people who didn't ask questions, because it's a gift that you're giving to the other person.
It's not surprising. I mean, I've helped so many people with networking over the course of my career, because
Yeah.
people think that it's really easy when you're extroverted. They're like, "Oh, you just walk into a room, Scott, and you know everybody, and you no, I'm 20 something years in business in a community. I run a huge wine festival. I've met so many great humans through that time, but I didn't just meet them. I learned about them. And so my number one tool and trick is go into the room and think nothing about yourself. Just try to learn everything you can from a few people. They will walk out of the room feeling like you were the coolest person they met all day because all they did was talk about themselves.
That's right. Right. They will say,
So
we had
simple.
such a great conversation. And of course, they didn't learn anything from you. But nonetheless, it was a great connection for them.
And they're curious about your next meeting. They're interested.
Right.
If
Right.
you were to reach out to them and say, hey, Jeff, I'd love to grab coffee with you one day. Do you have some time in the next 2 weeks that we could grab a cup of coffee? You created the curiosity inside of them. Why did he want to know so much about me?
Yeah, exactly.
It's so simple.
I know. It's so true. But you have to choose that curiosity to do it. And I think what you just said is like when you walk into that room, you're making a choice to say, I'm going to get curious about a set of people and go with that. All right. So that's number one. Then what comes after curiosity is what I call make it safe. And this is a reflection that if I'm curious, even if I'm really curious to learn from you, if you don't feel safe to tell me your truth, especially if it's a hard truth, I'm not going to learn it from you. You're not going to share it with me. I'm not going to get the full truth from you. And when I talk about safe, what I really mean is it comfortable for you? Is it easy for you? Is it appealing for you to be sharing with me what you have to say? And I mean, I'll give you a very personal example, which is I have a teenage daughter who's 15 years old. When she comes home from school and or at dinner, and I say to her, how was your day? What did you learn? What happened? You could probably predict absolutely nothing. I get nothing from her. But if I really want to learn from her, I got to go on the time and space and place where it's, quote, safe for her, which means it's 11 p.m. She's done with her homework. She's done talking to her friends. I'm completely exhausted. But if I want to find out anything about my daughter's life, that's when I need to hang out with her in her room. And at that point in time, it just all pours out. She doesn't want me to leave. Of course, I'm like ready to sleep, but I'm there because that's when it's safe. And so part of making it safe is to create a connection with the other person on their terms and on their turf. And same thing in the world of work too. Like I interviewed a number of CEOs for the book, and CEOs are notorious for being lied to and for not getting the truth. People tell CEOs what they think the CEO wants to hear, what they think is going to make them look good. So I said to these CEOs, how did you get the truth out of people? Especially people several layers away from you who might be really intimidated by you. And what the basic thing they said is I would never bring them into my office, make them sit across the big intimidating CEO desk from me and assume I'm going to get the truth from them. They're going to be too intimidated. I'm going to go where they are. We're going to have lunch at the cafeteria. We're going to go on a ride along. We're going to take a walk together. We're going to sit across a couch. I mean, whatever it is. And they knew that there was no single answer as to when the right time and place was to make it safe for someone other than whatever is most comfortable for them, be on their terms and their turf. And that's part of making it safe. The other parts of making it safe are if we want people to open up to us, we got to open up first a little bit ourselves. That doesn't mean we do all the talking, but at minimum, it means we tell them why we're curious, why we're interested, why we're asking the question. Because a lot of times, especially if there's any kind of power difference or any other line of difference we're crossing, people will be suspicious about our agenda for asking these questions. What are they really trying to get out of me? Why is he really is he evaluating me? Is he, whatever. And if we can just open up and say, look, here's what I'm struggling with. Here's why I'm asking. Here's why I'm so interested. All of a sudden we just, reveal our agenda. And especially if we can do that in a way that makes ourselves a little bit vulnerable, it increases the chance they will feel safe being vulnerable as well. And then the last thing I like to just say about make it safe is radiating resilience. It's basically showing the other person that I can handle your truth. I'm not going to crumble. I'm not going to get pissed off. I'm not going to punish you for it. If you have something to say that's hard for me to hear, I'm resilient. And so like an easy way to do that is just to simply say to the other person, look, if I were in your shoes, I might be really frustrated with me right now. I might be really annoyed. I don't know what you're feeling, but if it's any of that or anything else, I would love to hear it and understand it. When you do something like that, you're preempting a sense that is this person resilient or not, or are they fragile? And you're just demonstrating to them, I can hear it. And then of course you have to live up to that once they share it with you. So all of that is kind of making it safe.
I love it. And I think it's interesting because number one, to your point about the teenagers, I have an 18 and a 15-year-old.
That's exactly what I have too. That's
yeah.
Funny.
So my 18-year-old graduated from high school just yesterday. And
congrats.
Thanks. And is yours also, or do you have one more year?
Mine is graduating in about a week from today. Yeah.
It's a very surreal moment in parenting because this transitional thing that nobody talks about is you're very vulnerable, and the kids are super on edge. Mom is super on edge. I'm super. I mean, the ride to the actual graduation was embarrassing by all three parts. You know, he's like, "You two are embarrassing. We're bickering over the air conditioning. It's stupid, but we're all uncomfortable."
Yeah.
And instead of talking about it, because it's very uncomfortable and it's hard and it's not in that safe space, it's not at the right time, it's not with all three of us. You know, our youngest son wasn't there, but um, you know, I also find that my son wakes up grumpy, and then as the day goes on, he thaws. And
Uh-huh.
at the end of the night, same exact thing as you. Like my wife will be like, "You need to go to bed earlier," and I'm like, "I do, Adrian." But at the end of the day, if I'm not, at least sometimes I just go into his room and lay on his bed, and he'll be like, "What are you doing in here?" And he gives me nothing. And then other times I go and lay on his bed, and we start wrestling, or we have
Yeah.
like some kind of connectivity, and or he tells me stuff. And it's just, if I try to force it, it doesn't work. As a CEO, one thing that I think is really interesting, just another point that you made, is I have found it to be valuable to not just try to get them into safe space for the big conversations, but to be there for the little moments. When someone loses a family member and you just drop into their office and into their space, and you are thinking of them, you're saying something not in front of everybody, so it's not a show, it is all about them. You're creating conversations because you genuinely care.
Yes.
These are the
Yes.
things that people start to feel safe with you on. And I've had employees come to me when they're super tight on money. And, I literally we'll pull something out of cash in our wallet and hand it to them and say, look, forget all the other stuff. Go take care of what you need to. We'll worry about business later. And and that, when they do have an issue, they'll come right into the office and they'll say something, or they'll say something in front of other people, and the other people will say, "I can't believe you said that." And I'm grateful they did.
Yeah.
So, that's a very, very powerful thing. And the last thing I'll say is, since 2020, in my company, we do something called Monday morning huddles, and then
Mhm.
on Fridays we do Fridays wins and challenges.
Love it.
And all of our home office, like back office people, almost 30 people every Monday, we get on for 30 to 40 minutes at 9 o'clock, and we just talk about what happened over the weekend.
Mm.
And it is, guess what? For all you business people, it is not ROI in the way that we're making money, but it is ROI in the sense that when everybody starts to understand each other as humans, when we're curious on why Bill in Charlottesville likes to go to breweries, and that, oh wow, he brews his own beer, and when two people both like horses and they're connecting over that, now they have to work together, their connection is deeper. They actually care about each other. This is care, going back to the very first thing you said. So these are all positive things that, just further validate the research and the methodology that I'm so grateful to have been able to execute and learn from.
I love it. We do something very similar in my own organization as well on Mondays. Actually, we have a team call, and every week the call is hosted by a different team member, and it starts with playing music. That team member chooses that song, and then they start by sharing, "Here's why that song is meaningful to me personally," and then they get to pick a question that's about something that happened over your weekend, or something that you learned from, or someone who means something to you, and then we break out into small groups of two or three. We spend about 10 minutes just sharing all those kinds of things, and then they bring us back together, and it makes such a difference. I mean, it's like that is how you actually build the foundational connection that is underneath all of safety.
I love it. I love it. All right, keep walking us through, because people are learning today, and they're going to learn to be more curious through this process.
Great. So number 3 is called pose quality questions. This is the heart of the ask approach, the questions that we actually pose to other people. And I distinguish between quality questions versus crummy questions, because I think a lot of what passes for questions, a lot of what actually has question marks next to it, are not actually quality questions. They're crummy questions. My definition of a quality question is simply a question that helps us learn something important from other people. And a crummy question is a question that actually blocks learning. And so just to spend a minute on crummy questions, because like a lot of what we do is crummy questions. There's different kinds of crummy questions. One of them is what I call clumsy questions. These are questions that might be intended to actually be real questions, but they turn out to be really hard to answer. Maybe because you're asking 4 questions in a row, and so people don't know which one to answer. Or maybe you're asking a question and then you're answering it yourself with your own opinion. My favorite kind of crummy question is when someone will say something and then they'll end it by saying, "Isn't that right?" And they might actually want to know, are you agreeing with them? But when they say it like that, "Isn't that right?" or "just right," it makes it very difficult for the other person to tell you what they really think, because it kind of implies that what they're saying is right. So that's an example of a crummy question. There's also kinds of sneaky questions, what you would see a lawyer do, trying to lead a witness to admit that they committed a crime, or even just gently sneaking questions like, well, wouldn't it be better if we turned the air conditioning down? Aren't we all feeling a little cold? Or, if we went here for dinner, or all kinds of things that are just sort of like gentle suggestions, as opposed to just sort of saying what I think and then asking what the other person thinks. And people get it. They feel manipulated when sneaky questions. And then also people ask attack questions. Why would you ever think that? Which is more like, using questions as a weapon. So all of those kinds of things are not really quality questions. Quality questions, I think, are kind of like almost how a surgeon might think about their scalpel and all the other different tools. Depending on what you're trying to get at, there's a different question. And in the book, I identify a full taxonomy of different kinds of quality questions that we can ask. And most people have a very narrow repertoire. We've never actually been taught what are different questions that you can ask depending on what you're trying to learn. So just to give you one example, maybe one of my favorite overlooked quality questions is simply a question strategy that I call request reactions. Request reactions is just simply saying to the other person, "Hey, here's what I think," or "Here's what I'm asking you to do," or "Here's whatever." Pause. What's your reaction to that? How does that sit with you? How does that land with you? How does that strike you? What does that make you think? What might I be overlooking? Any one of those kinds of things will give the other person a chance to actually let us know what they think about our thinking. And I feel like so often we assume that if they disagree, they're just going to tell us, or if it doesn't sit right, they're going to tell us. But for all the reasons we just talked about people not feeling safe, they may not tell us. I know when I first learned that strategy, I was a new manager and I was managing someone, and I had just given him a bunch of kind of guidance and direction. And then I remembered someone that I had been trained on asked this question. And so I just said to him, "Hey, what are your reactions to that?" And he's paused and he looked at me for a second. He said, "Look, if you want to know my honest reaction, I'm totally demoralized because what you just said to me makes no sense." And I was shocked. I thought we were good. He was about to execute. All that kind of thing. Had I not asked that question, I never would have known that it made no sense to him. That gave us a chance to kind of peel it back and be like, "Why do you think that makes no sense? And here's why I think it makes sense." And it just turned out we had different information about what our client wanted. Then we put all our information together. We could figure out, all right, here's the best path forward. But we might have wasted weeks, and our relationship might have totally degraded had I not just asked him, "What are your reactions to that?" So that's one example. There's many others as well.
So with crummy questions, I think something that comes to mind to me is the person whose face is in their phone and they're not listening, and then they come into the conversation and then they ask a question of something that was just talked about, which happens so often today in most social settings. I mean, whether it's in the office or it's at home, these are things that happen. People are so disconnected and they want to be connected and they want to be a part of the conversation, and they ask that question. You're like, oh,
We just
it's
talked
so
about that.
frustrating.
Yeah, exactly. That's probably a good segue to number 4, which is about listening. And it's called Listen to Learn. And I found a statistic, 96% of us think we're good listeners. But we really only retain half of what we actually hear. And there's such a big difference between thinking we're listening versus actually hearing what the other person is really telling us, what they're saying and also what they're not saying. And so listening to learn is really about bringing that intention to be present, to really take in what's most important, not just the content of what someone says, the facts, the figures, the logic, the claims, the arguments, but also what's the emotion that they're expressing and displaying. Often the emotion is more important than the content of what they have to be saying, but also even the actions. Like, what are you observing them doing? Are they agreeing with you? Are they pushing back? Are they asking questions? The actions that people take are a type of information as well. And so content, emotion, and actions are 3 channels that we need to be listening for and listening through. I think of it almost the way that I think a music aficionado they can listen for the vocals, and they can listen for the percussion, and they can listen, for the harmony. and they could isolate each one, but they can also put it together in a way that gives them such a richer understanding of that piece of music. And we can do the same with ourselves. We can train ourselves for each of those different kinds of things. Um, I interviewed another kind of professional listener that I interviewed for the book, was journalists, because journalists are constantly asking questions and listening. And so I interviewed one journalist, Jenny West Anderson, and um, she would say to me that she would record her interviews with her subjects, and then she'd go back and listen to them 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. And what was striking to me, she said, every time I listened to it, I heard something I just literally had not heard before the time before, and then the third time, and then the fourth time. And I think to myself, if a professional listener like her is missing something on time 2 and time 3, how much are the rest of us mere mortals literally just not hearing in terms of what the other person is saying to us?
What a good strategy. I wish more journalists would do that, because I have done so many interviews where they write the exact wrong thing
Right.
or nothing close. I was just in an article the other day where something that I said was attributed to someone else, and it was probably the best thing I said the entire time. And I'm reading this thing and I'm like, oh man, this guy
Yeah,
didn't say that. I said that.
I
And it's
know.
what I say every time. And then they attribute it to the wrong person. And I'm like, they weren't even listening.
It's so frustrating.
They were just making stuff up as they went.
Yeah. Now, some
So
journalists can overcome that. I mean, when I'm interviewed by journalists, I so much prefer that before they publish the article, they just come back to me and say, "Here's what I think you said, and what I'm planning to quote you on. Is that right?" That probably happens like 1 out of every 5 times, but it's so, I so appreciate it so much. And there's an analog of that to what we can do in our conversations, which is a strategy I just call paraphrase and test. So when you're listening to someone, just pause for a second and say, "Hey, this is what I think I heard you just say. Did I get that right, or did I miss something, or what would you modify to what I took away?" And it's amazing to me. This is, if your listeners take away nothing else from this episode, this is one immediately applicable strategy that is like, it's magic. If you just paraphrase, "Here's what I think I heard you say. Did I get that right?" It has 3 benefits. Like, the first benefit is, chances are you didn't get it right. And so you actually get the chance to correct your understanding. At least 50% of the time, when I paraphrase and say it back to the other person, they will say to me, "Well, you kind of got it, but that's not exactly what I was saying." Or, "That is what I said, but now that you say it back to me, I realize I have something else to say." So you just get better information. The second benefit is that it slows things down, especially if it's a tense conversation. You're in the heat of the moment. You're in this point counterpoint ping pong match. If you just change it up and say, like, "Before I make my next point back to you, I just want to check that I understand what you said," it changes the whole energy of the conversation. And then the third thing is, and this might be the most important, it just says to the other person, "I care about you. Like, I care about you enough that I'm going to take my own time and energy to, in my own words, state back what I think I heard you say and ask if I got it." It brings people closer. So this is the magic move. It's just paraphrase and check back if you understood them, and it changes everything about your listening.
well, this is also taught in Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference,
Yep.
when the famous FBI negotiator and hostage negotiator, and mirroring in general helps someone feel heard. So if there's a way that we can have some level of repeating what someone has said in any capacity, they feel more in tune with you as a human, because they actually think you're taking, even if you don't agree on anything, they at least think you're listening to their points. And
Yeah.
that's, again, so powerful.
Negotiators use this, mediators use this, therapists use this, marriage counselors use, I mean, and people have different names for it.
Right.
But the reason people continue to share it is because we don't do it enough. Like, it is just so, it's so striking how powerful it is, and yet how rarely it actually gets done.
Yeah, I do it all the time because I'm so fast and my brain moves so quick that I do it, because sometimes I am misinterpreting, or I'm listening to the last part, and I read emails sometimes and I've read like the first 4 lines of the email and I'm like, "Oh, okay, I already know what this is about." And
Right.
someone will be
Totally.
like, "Hey, did you read the end of the email, Scott?" And I'm like, "Oh, darn it. No, I
Right.
didn't."
Yeah. And you can
So,
do this on email too. Sometimes people will send me kind of a convoluted email, or maybe an email that's triggering a reaction in me. And before I shoot back, some reaction, I can just say, "Let me just check. Is this what you're asking me? Is this what you're saying to me? And if not, can you clarify?" And so usually whatever is getting me pissed off is not as bad as I thought it was. They just clarify it. And, especially if it's somebody on my own team, it's usually coming from a good place, even if that's not how I read it the first time.
I call that, I love that, and I use the power of the voice text. So
Mm,
if I'm misinterpreted or somebody asks me a follow-up question and I have not clearly communicated, because again, we have a choice. We can say it's somebody else misinterpreting what we said, or it can be me not saying it clear enough. And I like to err on the side of my lack of clarity in my
yeah.
message. And when I do
Yes.
that, then I just leave a quick voice message that says, "Hey Jeff, that must have sounded ridiculous. I'm really sorry. Here's what I meant by that. And listen, either way, I'm good. I just wanted you to know that this was where my head was at, but lead me. This is your cup of tea, and I'm happy to bounce back if you want to do this or whatever it may be." And it's amazing how I'll get like the heart emoji on it or something. Someone's like, "Oh, dude, I love that. Thank you."
Yeah, yeah,
Ver-
and what I love about that is that even if the other person is not making the move of saying to you, "Scott, this is what I think you're saying. Did I get that right?" You can sense that maybe they should be making that move, and so you're giving them the clarification that they need and are not yet asking for. And I love the fact that you then you're adding a much richer texture of how to do it by bringing your voice into it, through, like through a voice note.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I wrote emails over the years, and I go back at the end of every email and write the beginning. So I am results oriented to the point where I actually will go right into, I won't even put the person's name in the email. I literally just immediately go, "What are we doing here? And how are we going?" Like I'm just going right when I have to solve something, all things go out. And so I've gotten in the habit in my life of going down to the bottom, finishing the email, then going back up to the top and writing, "Hey, Jeff, so sorry that missed you the other day. Hope your kids are doing great. I know graduation's coming up. Listen, couple quick things. Boom." And that's my defense mechanism because I'm horrible at it. And
Yeah,
so I
that's
have to
great self
recognize it and
awareness.
change.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Maybe that's a good segue to the fifth step, which is all about reflecting and changing. Um, it's called reflect and reconnect. And this is basically to say, like, once we ask a good question, once we listen well, it all comes down to how do we process what they told us. And so reflection is the way that we convert experience into insight and insight into action. And if we don't do that, we just have the experience, but we don't actually grow from it. And so I think a lot of people think reflection, I don't have time for reflection. It's too esoteric. I'd have to go on a retreat and meditate or whatever. But reflection can be very simple and practical. And so I talk about a process called sift it and turn it. Sifted is basically to say, okay, if they told me 30 things in the span of the conversation, I need to sift out what are the most important 3 to 5 things that I heard from them. Not everything that someone says to us is equally important for us to take in. Some stuff that they say to us we should not take in because maybe it's biased or it's crap or it's just not meant for us. And so we just take a minute and sift it. That could mean just thinking through what you heard. That could mean sifting through your notes. Sometimes I say it's useful to do it with a friend or a colleague so that you're not sifting out the wrong things as well, just through your own biases. But just sift it and say, all right, here are the nuggets, and I'm gonna release the rest of it. And then turn it just means turn it over in your mind 3 times. The first time is to say, how does what I heard change my story about the other person or about myself or about the situation, what's going on? The second turn is based on that story shift, what steps can I take? Maybe I want to apologize to them. Maybe I want to double down. Maybe I want to, make a left turn here or whatever, but what steps can we take? And then the third turn is just to say, is there anything here that gives me any insight about my own stuff, my own deeper stuff? Like maybe to your point, well, I'm realizing that my way of being is that I don't spend enough time just, opening by a human connection or different things like that. And if we can make those 3 turns, story, steps, stuff, we're squeezing the most possible learning we can out of what someone shares with us. But I call it reflect and reconnect because the reconnect is just as important. That's closing the loop with the other person. That's going back to the other person and saying, hey, look, thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the risk if it felt risky to do that. Let me tell you what I'm taking away from what I heard you say. Here's how it's helping me grow. And here's what I'm going to actually do about it. And by the way, is there anything different you would have wanted me to take away? Or maybe there's something else you were hoping I was taking away from that. When we do that kind of loop closing, I think it's very rare for people to get that kind of experience. And it shows them that they didn't waste their time. It shows them how much you mean to them, how much they mean to you, and how powerful their voice is to you. I think it also brings you closer and just significantly increases the chances of that sharing happening over and over again.
Yeah, so this is a great strategy just all the way through to also utilize in our relationships with our spouses. I mean,
Totally.
I'm curious, how have you changed since you've done this research, since you've published this book? What are you doing differently in your marriage?
Yeah. Well, I'll say I wrote the book that I need to read as well. And so this is, as much as I have learned this stuff and taught various pieces of this over the years, like I'm a student of it as much as anything else. And so, and probably for me, the hardest context to apply this in is inside my marriage. But the other day, my wife and I were arguing about something. We were going to visit a cousin over the summer, and she wanted to basically insist on telling the cousin that on Friday nights our family observes Shabbat, like the Sabbath on Friday nights. And I was like, I don't want to impose that on the cousin. I don't want to make them uncomfortable, whatever else. And she was really like intent on being able to say this. And I decided, instead of fighting her, I was just going to say to her, well, what would you say to the person? And how would you think about whether or not it inconveniences them? And in the end, I basically, we got to the place of like, okay, if we want to say that, let's see what the cousin how the cousin reacts. And I just decided to make a choice to flip from fighting her to flip to saying like, let me just hear more about what you're thinking, because maybe you're thinking something totally different than what I was assuming you were going to actually want to do. And of course, it's much more reasonable than what I thought. So that's just one example. And there's probably, for every one of those examples, there's probably 10 examples when I should have done something like that. But if I can try to catch myself even 1 out of 5 or 10 times, like it changes the relationship.
Well, you're better every day. I mean, at the
Yeah.
end of the day, if we're growing, we're not dying. And if
Yeah.
we're investing in our relationships, that means they're not dying as well. Even
Yeah.
if it's slow and a little bit less, it's not as fast as we want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when I was listening to the part about making it safe, I was thinking about something that we do. We have a thing that we teach called ROM, and it came from my wife and I having our second child. 3 years and 3 days to the day. I think that it's great to take care of the oldest and take him everywhere and give her time to connect with the baby, because there's literally nothing I can do with it. Nothing. Like, they needs to eat, it needs to
Right.
sleep, and nothing. I am useless to this child in the very beginning.
Yeah.
But all the fun parts of parenting I was taking away from her, right? And so we end up on a trip that I insist we go on, and we're on this boat. And I've told this story in this podcast many times, but it's good to hear if it's your first one. We're heading over to Tortola, and we're on this ferry, and she kind of grabs me and kisses me and says, "This is our ROM week." And I said, "I love the way that sounds. I don't know what it means." And she goes, "It's the Rekindle Our Marriage week."
Uh-huh.
And now all she had to do was plant the idea for me. Once the idea was planted, it's my job to harvest and water and cultivate, and that's what we do. She gives me a signal, and I take that signal and I build it, and it's turned into something where I learned that when we start to struggle in any way, we start to bicker too much, we start to have too many challenges, we're not seeing eye to eye, we have to separate, because we can't have a safe space to the level we need it sometimes unless we actually separate from mom, from dad, from because it's in moments it's too hard. It almost takes a day. I call it a day to thaw. And then the last day you're kind of going back into dad and mom mode, and you're kind of you could see the vacation dwindling. And but that is the safe space that's been created, where we learn that every 6 months we do this at a minimum, preferably every quarter, even if it's a quarterly weekend, just to separate. You remember that you like each other, you don't just love each other, and when you do that, you communicate better.
Now, when you
And
say separate, do you mean take separate space and time away from each other, or
no,
you
no,
two together
together,
separate from the
together,
family?
separating from the family, together,
Yeah.
separating from the family. I mean, I think
Yeah.
separation, I think separation apart is also powerful and very underrated in marriages,
I
because
agree.
independence is you have to have your own life. You have to have your own wants and needs and interests, and it's when you are only with each other that it can become very challenging. Being one is very hard, but now I'm talking specifically this time about separating just from our day-to-day lives,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and if work feels like it's too much for her, I'm too involved or engaged, or maybe the kids, maybe we're doing soccer tournaments all the time, and that means that we have no consistency. And I just we have to recognize that in each other. And at different times we've said, hey, this is what we need. Or and I mean, we're normal couples. Like it's not like we definitely argue about little things like whose side the air conditioning is blowing too many, it's
That's
my
such a classic one. I know.
it's the
I've done.
worst. It's the
Yeah.
worst. I just set a temperature and I turn it on. And if she wants it lower, I turn it down. And all of us get cold. And then if she has her own side, so her side blows 1,000 miles an hour at like 60 degrees, and everyone in the car is freezing. So it's so painful to me. And I can't, no matter how many times we get in the car, I think the only rule we have is that whoever's driving and whoever car it is, they control the decision making of
Right.
that.
I remember when I was a kid, my parents used to fight about the air conditioning to such a point they would turn it on and off, and the car shorted out. And I thought that that's kind of like like the perfect metaphor for life.
Eh,
But what you said resonates in my own life and marriage too. My wife and I do something similar, where a few times a year we try to get away. But also, she herself takes every quarter she takes a weekend away by herself as well. And so both, I think, kinds of separation really matter.
Yeah, it's very valuable. But your point is, in order to be curious at a higher level, having a safe space in our lives and in our relationships, sometimes it requires more work. It
Totally.
requires a little bit of extra. And it's not like I could have a deep conversation on a Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m. in the middle of 27 people. I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm deep immediately.
Yeah.
My wife has got to have separation. There's no way she's having that level. She there I can't but she can talk to me in the mornings and be like, "Hey, this weekend we're doing this." And I have to separate to actually go through all that. I cannot be in my day because I'm so present where I'm at that I'm not thinking about this weekend. And
Yeah.
so learning each other's positives and the way we communicate has helped a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that everyone's different. Everyone's got a different profile, a different set of preferences on this. And if I'm trying to learn from you, I can't assume that my way is going to be your way. I got to go. I got to know what your way is, and then match to your way if I'm trying to figure out what's going on for you.
Yeah, spending our time giving. Ultimately, what your message resonates the inside of me. The most important thing that I get from this is every time in life when I'm giving to somebody else, I'm receiving whatever it is that I need. When I'm focused on taking from someone whatever it is that I want from them, I always fail. I'm
Yeah.
always empty. I'm always lost. And we all do this at different times in our lives. We find ourselves in moments where we're doing this, but the relationship building and the depth of those relationships, asking the right questions with the right methodology, I love it. And it's simple enough to teach. How are you teaching this and how are people executing it? And where are you seeing the best results? Is there an area like are you seeing it with more adults than children, or are you able to kind of get the message out at a younger age? How are you seeing this executed that's really making an impact?
Yeah, so it's in a couple of different domains. I mean, there's the kind of individual domain, team domain, and then also with kids as well. The individual domain, takes the form of kind of like workshops and trainings and coaching and different things like that. And I believe that this is a skill set. This is learnable. This is not something that some people are born with, other people aren't born with. And so, seeing people move from what I refer to and draw from pre-existing framework of like unconscious incompetence, where we don't even know that we're not good at it, all the way to actually being conscious of like, okay, I'm doing this now, and all the way to the point of practicing enough where it just feels fluid and natural. To me, that I see that all the time, and it can be very fast in terms of like, just try this one question first, just ask yourself this first. And so that's the individual level. There's also stuff with teams where you can actually build this into your own teams. Like in my own organization, another thing we do is these things called 2x2s, where a couple times a year, everybody who works with each other just has that. We have this ritual where you say to the other person, what's two things I'm doing well? What's two things I could be doing better? And that just kind of implants that kind of curiosity into the DNA of the functioning of the organization. And so you can start to see all this learning start to happen in teams that otherwise wouldn't happen, because people might feel too awkward asking that question, or may just not get around to it or whatever. So there's a whole set of things. And I talk about this in the book as well, about how do you build this into teams. And then the organization that I co-lead called Transcend is basically trying to deal with how do we get kids more engaged? How do we get kids more curious? Because kids actually are the most curious people of all. By the time they're 4 years old, they're asking like literally 400 questions a day. And then once we send them to school, that curiosity basically shuts off because schools tell kids, sit down, shut up, give the right answer. It's just about giving answers, getting it right, as opposed to being curious. And so the organization that Transcend is trying to flip that on its head and say, how do we actually follow the kids' curiosity? How do we continue to fan the flames of their passion so that they're learning the things they need to do, but while following their own interests, while doing projects that really have real relevance to them? So those are three different areas that I'm trying to advance this in.
I love the message, and I definitely appreciate the push for curiosity. I think that I read a book. I think it's called Curiosity by Robert Glazer
Mm-hmm.
several years ago, and he's a Hollywood producer. Did major movies. I think he did Splash and a couple of other like really big ones over the course of time that people would know. But his entire career was shaped by him just asking extra questions and being curious about other producers and other people in life. And if we're teaching kids that in an environment where they're literally being shut down from curiosity, there were so many times we were asking questions that revolve around why as children that we just can't get an answer. And if you just give that answer, it's empowering to them. They feel like they help own the result.
I totally agree. And sometimes we don't know the answer. And then I think sometimes adults feel like, well, I can't say to the kid, I don't know the answer. But the most empowering thing you can possibly do is say, that's an incredible question. I don't know either. How can we go find out? Let's figure
Yeah,
it out together. Where can we go
together,
learn that?
right?
Yeah. I mean, that is the biggest gift you can give your kid.
Yeah, I do really appreciate that logic. As my son approaches going to college, one of the things that I've taught him is, listen, I care a whole lot less about the grades you receive. I care a whole lot less about the specialty university that you have to attend. What I care about is that you're curious about the next chapter of your life, that you're
Yes.
you're exploring where you want to be and how you want to make an impact in the world, and you're asking enough questions to find the version of you that you're going to be comfortable with, not something that you're focused on that you think we want or someone else wants. I feel like the first part of so many of our lives we spend trying to please people that all they wanted for us was for us to be happy and focused on what's good for ourselves, not what's good for them. And it takes that learning curve to really get there. But the more they ask questions, Jeff, the more they actually learn that quicker, I would imagine.
I
So
totally agree. And what a gift to give a child to have that as the parental attitude and stance to say, I want you to explore. I want you to learn, not I want you to just do it my way or society's way.
I got in a whole discussion a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to say argument. We were with some friends, and I was like, I'd rather see my kid major in philosophy than something that's not going to provide them any level of logic or concepts. I want them to think differently when they come out. That's what I want. I don't. They're not going to more than likely have a job in that career that they're going to learn about until they do a lot more schooling, until they do. And you got your doctorate, you know this better than anybody. Like, there's a protocol, but in order to become an expert in anything, especially education, you've got to go for a lot longer. So if you can lay a foundation and groundwork to Socratic method or some kind of logical arguments, it's powerful.
Especially because if we just zero in on like what's the job I'm going to get, like I'm going to be a coder or I'm going to be a whatever this is, the world is changing so fast. Those jobs are shifting, and so if you attach everything to that job, you're not you're going to be in, I think, real trouble. Versus if you say like, how do I actually understand myself, my purpose, how to think, how to connect with other people? Those are the things that I think are actually the enduring skills.
Yeah, super good, man. And as a parent, keep asking questions, because the more curious we are, the
Yes.
just like the point I made earlier about my friend asking me a question that made me think in a different way, we can do that for our kids. And I think
Yes.
that's also really, really powerful, and something that could really go a long way.
Totally agree. Well said. Amen.
So, all right, Jeff, how do they find you? How does everybody get more of the ask methodology, tapping into the hidden wisdom of people around you for unexpected breakthroughs in leadership and life? A word we like to talk about here, life.
Yes, life. So there's a website, www.askapproach.com. You can get lots of resources on that. There's also a diagnostic that can help you see how good are you at actually learning from other people. Which parts of the Ask Approach are you better and worse at? Which ones can you stand to learn more from? So lots of stuff on askapproach.com. I also love to connect with people on LinkedIn. So you can just find me, Jeff Wetzler, and connect with me there too.
That's awesome. Well, I'm grateful you joined us on the show, and I'm grateful to share your message. And I can't wait to share your book and information with people on our team or all across the companies.
Thank you. I love this conversation. Really appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.